Maybe next time, we bring someone who actually understands AI. The sentence landed before anyone even looked at him, sharp and effortless, like it had been rehearsed, and then the room followed with a ripple of restrained laughter, not loud, not wild, just enough to signal agreement, just enough to isolate the one man still standing near the far end of the glass conference table, badge clipped slightly crooked against a navy blazer that had seen better days. Marcus Reed didn't move, didn't blink. Didn't shift his weight even as 20 pairs of eyes slid over him and then away again like he was already irrelevant. The projector hummed softly above, casting a pale blue light across polished oak and stainless steel water pitchers. The skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched wide under a hazy Manhattan afternoon, 38 floors up and quiet enough to hear the faint click of a pen tapping against a leather folder. Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair, sleeves crisp, cufflinks catching the light, posture loose in the way only someone completely in control could afford. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority settled into his tone like it belonged there. "We're discussing a $2.4 billion AI partnership," he added, glancing briefly at the others before letting his gaze pass over Marcus again. "Not a coding bootcamp review." Another low wave of amusement, softer this time, more careful, people measuring how far they could go, how much they could align without overcommitting. Marcus's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, not gripping, not tense, just there, steady. His eyes moved once, from Daniel to the projected slide, a dense grid of model outputs and projected error margins, numbers stacked with confidence, assumptions hidden beneath polished formatting. He inhaled slowly, barely noticeable, like someone preparing to speak but not rushing it. The air conditioning whispered through the vents above, carrying the faint scent of coffee and dry erase markers. A junior analyst shifted in her seat, glancing between Marcus and the screen, uncertainty flickering for a fraction of a second before discipline pulled her gaze back down to her notes. Daniel followed the slide with a small nod, satisfied. "As you can see, the system scales cleanly under load," he said, tapping the screen with a laser pointer, a red dot dancing across projections that no one questioned out loud. Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, not yet, just observing, tracing a single line buried 3 layers deep in the data where the curve bent just a little too perfectly, just enough to suggest something had been overlooked or ignored. He opened his mouth, not to challenge, not to confront, but to clarify, and that was when Daniel lifted a hand, subtle but absolute, cutting the moment before it could exist. "We're good here," Daniel said, already turning his attention back to the investors dialing in remotely, already moving forward as if Marcus had never been part of the equation. The room followed his lead instantly, conversations shifting, screens updating, momentum reclaiming the space, and Marcus closed his mouth again, not out of hesitation, not out of doubt, but because he understood something no one else in that room seemed to yet. That sometimes the loudest mistake isn't the one you hear, it's the one everyone chooses to ignore. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that barely broke the silence, and Marcus stepped inside without looking back, the faint echo of voices from the conference room dissolving as the doors closed, sealing him into a narrow space filled with white light and mirrored steel, his reflection staring back at him from 3 angles, same calm eyes, same steady posture, same badge that still read temporary advisor in small, impersonal font. He reached forward and pressed the lobby button. The panel responded with a muted click, and then nothing but the low mechanical hum as the car began its descent. 38 floors of quiet distance between him and a room that had already decided who he was. He exhaled slowly, not heavy, not frustrated, just controlled, like someone who had learned a long time ago that reaction was a luxury he could not afford. His gaze dropped briefly to his hands, fingers relaxed. No tremor, no tension, just stillness, as if the moment had passed through him without leaving a mark, but it had, not as anger, not as humiliation, but as confirmation, the kind that settles deeper than emotion, the kind that tells you exactly where you stand without needing anyone to say it out loud. The numbers from the slide replayed quietly in his mind, the curve, the projection, the missing variance hidden beneath a clean presentation. It was not a dramatic flaw, not something that would explode immediately. It was worse than that, subtle, patient, The kind of error that waits until the stakes are too high to fix without consequence. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, just enough to see the architecture behind the numbers, the structure he had designed years ago, the same foundation now being presented as if it were understood, as if it were complete, as if it were safe. The elevator passed the 27th floor, then the 26th. Each number lighting up and disappearing just as quickly, time moving forward whether anyone was ready or not. Somewhere above him, the meeting continued, voices confident, decisions forming, commitments inching closer to something irreversible. Marcus opened his eyes again, watching his reflection instead of the numbers now. There was no anger there, no urgency, only clarity. The kind that comes when you stop expecting to be heard and start understanding that you do not need to be the system. They were discussing was not just another model, not just another product. It was his work, his architecture, the core logic built during years no one in that room had seen, late nights, borrowed machines, contracts that ended before recognition could begin, and now it sat at the center of a deal worth billions, handled by people who believed they understood it because they had access to the surface. The elevator slowed slightly at the 15th floor, pausing for a moment before continuing. Downward, no one entered, no one interrupted, just Marcus and the quiet hum of descent. He adjusted his sleeve absent-mindedly, smoothing a crease that did not matter, his mind already several steps ahead, not racing, not reacting, just aligning, the way it always did when something important shifted, because what had just happened upstairs was not the problem, it was the signal. And Marcus had learned to listen to signals long before anyone ever listened to him. The conference room did not notice the silence Marcus left behind because it was already filled with something louder, confidence layered over assumption. Daniel stood near the head of the table now, one hand resting lightly against the polished surface as he guided the conversation forward. The investors on the screen leaned in, their faces framed by soft lighting and neutral backdrops, waiting for reassurance, waiting for certainty. And Daniel delivered it without hesitation, his voice smooth, measured, practiced. The model has been stress-tested across multiple environments, he said, gesturing toward the projection as if the numbers themselves confirmed his authority. A few heads nodded, pens moved, agreements began forming in quiet, incremental ways, the kind that build momentum before anyone questions direction. Near the middle of the table, a senior analyst adjusted her glasses, her eyes lingering on the same section Marcus had studied moments earlier, a slight crease forming between her brows before she looked down again, choosing alignment over uncertainty. Because in rooms like this, doubt needed permission, and permission had not been given. Daniel clicked to the next slide, a clean transition, projection scaling upward, confidence embedded in every upward curve. This partnership positions us ahead of every competitor in the space, he continued, letting the number settle. $2.4 billion. Large enough to silence hesitation, large enough to make risk feel like opportunity. The room absorbed it, not with excitement, but with acceptance, the kind that comes when a decision feels inevitable. On the far end, one of the remote investors spoke up, his voice slightly delayed through the speaker system. And the core architecture, it can handle long-term adaptive load without degradation. A fair question, a necessary one. Daniel did not pause. Absolutely, he replied, too quickly, too certain, the answer landing before the question had fully settled. He tapped the screen again, highlighting a section of code summaries simplified into bullet points, none of it wrong on the surface, none of it complete beneath it. The analyst glanced up again, then away, her pen hovering above the page, still not moving. The air in the room shifted slightly, not enough for most to notice, just a fraction tighter, like something unspoken had entered and decided to stay. Daniel moved forward anyway, because momentum did not wait for discomfort, it moved through it. We are ready to finalize, he said, looking toward the lead investor, inviting agreement, inviting closure, and for a second, just a second, there was a pause, not resistance, not objection, just a gap where certainty should have been. Then the investor nodded slowly. Send the final documents, he said, and just like that, the room exhaled, quiet relief replacing tension, decisions locking into place, laptops closing, chairs shifting, the meeting dissolving into smaller conversations about next steps, timelines, announcements. No one mentioned the detail that had been overlooked. No one returned to the line that did not quite fit, because it was easier to move forward than to slow down, easier to trust the structure than to question the foundation. And far below, in the lobby where the noise of the city pressed faintly against glass doors, Marcus stepped out of the elevator and into a different kind of silence, one that did not need agreement to exist. The lobby carried a different kind of rhythm, softer but constant, the quiet shuffle of footsteps across polished stone, the muted ding of elevators opening and closing, the low murmur of conversations that never rose high enough to matter. Marcus stepped forward past the security desk without breaking stride. The guard glanced up briefly, then back down, a routine acknowledgement, nothing more. Outside the glass doors the city stretched wide and restless, yellow taxis sliding past in uneven lines, the distant echo of a horn folding into the hum of mid-afternoon traffic. Sunlight bounced off steel and glass, reflecting in sharp angles that shifted with every passing second. Marcus paused just long enough for the doors to open automatically, a soft breath of cool air brushing against his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The temperature sat somewhere in the mid-70s, warm but not heavy. The kind of day that made everything feel deceptively calm. He adjusted his sleeve again. Not out of habit this time, but to settle himself into the moment, because everything ahead required precision, not reaction. Across the street a digital billboard flickered through advertisements, colors changing too quickly to hold meaning. People moved around him in steady currents, each one carrying their own urgency, their own destination, none of them aware that somewhere above, decisions had just been made that would ripple far beyond that building. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit instantly, a clean interface, no clutter, no hesitation. He scrolled once, then stopped, a single contact pinned at the top, no name, just an initial. He tapped it. The line rang once, then connected, no greeting on the other end, just quiet presence. Marcus spoke evenly, not rushed, not dramatic. "They are moving forward with the current model," he said, eyes lifting briefly toward the skyline, tracking nothing in particular, just aligning his thoughts with the space around him. A pause followed, not confusion, not surprise, just confirmation, the kind that did not need words. Marcus continued. "The variance gap is still there." Another pause, slightly longer this time, as if the weight of that statement settled across both ends of the line. The voice on the other side finally responded, low, controlled. "And they ignored it." Marcus did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting to the reflection of the building behind him, glass stretching upward in perfect symmetry. "They chose not to see it," he said instead, precise in his wording, because there was a difference, and that difference mattered. A car passed close to the curb, the rush of air tugging lightly at his jacket, the world continuing forward without interruption. The voice on the line exhaled slowly, then asked, "Do we proceed?" And for a moment, just a moment, Marcus let the question sit, not because he did not know the answer, but because decisions like this deserved a second of stillness before they became irreversible. He glanced once more at the towering structure behind him, 38 floors of glass and confidence, and then back down at the screen, his expression unchanged, steady, certain. "No," he said quietly, the word landing without force but carrying all the weight it needed. "We do not move forward." Silence followed again, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, like a line had been drawn where none had existed before. Marcus ended the call with a single tap, the screen dimming instantly, and for a second he stood there, surrounded by motion, by noise, by a city that never paused, while everything that mattered had just shifted in complete silence. Upstairs the room had shifted into a quieter phase, not because anything had gone wrong, but because everything seemed settled. Documents were being prepared, assistants moved with quiet efficiency, laptops angled toward one another as final numbers were reviewed and rechecked. Daniel stood near the window now, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tablet that displayed the summary of the agreement. His reflection faintly visible in the glass behind the text, the skyline stretching out beyond him like confirmation of everything he believed he controlled. "We will have signatures ready within the hour," he said to no one in particular and to everyone at the same time, his tone relaxed, confident, final, across the table. The senior analyst hesitated again, her cursor blinking over a line of projected stability metrics, the same line that had not quite aligned earlier. She zoomed in slightly, then out again, as if clarity might appear with distance. But it did not, it only became easier to ignore. She glanced toward Daniel, then back at the screen, her shoulders tightening just enough to suggest discomfort. But not enough to interrupt the flow, because the room had already decided to move forward, and breaking that momentum required more than doubt, it required certainty, and certainty had just been dismissed. A soft notification sound broke through the air, subtle but distinct. One of the junior associates looked down at his laptop, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, not alarm, not confusion, just a pause that did not belong to the rhythm of the room. He clicked once, then again, his eyes scanning quickly. "Daniel," he said quietly, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to redirect attention. Daniel did not turn immediately. "1 second," he replied, still focused on the tablet in his hand. The associate hesitated, then spoke again, this time with a slight edge of urgency that had not been there before. "Daniel, you need to see this." That was enough. Daniel turned, a faint crease forming between his brows as he stepped closer, the tablet lowered slightly, replaced by the glow of the laptop screen as the associate angled it toward him. The room did not stop, not yet. Conversations continued in low tones, chairs shifted, pens tapped, but Daniel's attention narrowed completely. The message was short, direct, and impossible to reinterpret. He read it once, then again, as if repetition might change its meaning, but it did not. The partnership had been withdrawn, effective immediately, no negotiation, no delay. No explanation attached beyond a single line referencing structural concerns within the presented model. Daniel's posture changed, not dramatically. Just enough that the ease left his shoulders. The tablet in his hand felt suddenly irrelevant. He looked up, scanning the room as if the answer might be sitting somewhere among the people who had trusted him minutes earlier. The associate swallowed slightly. "It is from their side," he added, unnecessary clarification, but needed in the moment. The senior analyst looked up now, her eyes moving between Daniel and the screen, recognition dawning slowly, not surprise, but realization. The line she had hesitated on settling into place with quiet precision. Daniel straightened, drawing in a controlled breath. "There must be a mistake," he said, not to convince others, but to anchor himself, because the alternative required something he had not yet allowed. The room began to quiet, conversations tapering off as awareness spread in uneven waves. Laptops turned, screens refreshed, whispers replaced certainty, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the momentum that had carried them forward just minutes ago stopped completely, not with noise, not with impact, but with a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before. The room did not erupt, it did not panic, it simply slowed, like a machine that had been running too smoothly suddenly encountering resistance it could not explain. Daniel remained standing where he was, the laptop screen still angled toward him, the message unchanged, unmoving, definitive, the glow from the screen reflecting faintly against his face as if trying to illuminate something he had missed. Around him chairs stopped shifting. Voices faded into incomplete sentences, and one by one the people in the room began to look not at each other, but at the same invisible point where certainty had just disappeared. The senior analyst lowered her gaze back to her screen, but this time she did not look away from the line she had noticed earlier. She expanded it, tracing the data deeper, and what had once looked clean now felt fragile, the curve too perfect, the assumptions too aligned. Her breath slowed as understanding settled in, not sudden, not dramatic, just precise, like a quiet answer to a question she had not wanted to ask. Daniel finally moved, just a step back, then another, placing the laptop down on the table as if distance might change what it contained. "Get them on the line," he said, his voice controlled but thinner now, less certain. The associate nodded quickly, already dialing, already searching for a way to restore what had been lost. But the room knew before the call connected that something irreversible had already happened. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward the projection screen, the same slide still displayed, still confident, still wrong in a way that could no longer be ignored, and for the first time since the meeting began, he looked at them not as confirmation, but as a question. The analyst spoke quietly, almost To herself. The variance gap expands under sustained load. Her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried, because silence had made space for it. Daniel turned toward her, not sharply, not defensively, just slowly, as if he already knew what she was about to confirm. She did not look up. It does not stabilize, she added, her cursor circling the exact section Marcus had tried to address, and there it was, no longer hidden, no longer optional, just present, undeniable. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, a sequence of moments replaying in his mind with uncomfortable clarity, the interruption, the dismissal, the confidence that had filled the space where listening should have been. The phone call connected, a voice answered on the other end, formal, distant, final. Daniel spoke, choosing his words carefully. There seems to be some confusion regarding the withdrawal, he said, holding onto structure, onto process, onto anything that still felt controllable. The response came without hesitation. There is no confusion, the voice replied, calm and unyielding. Your team proceeded despite a critical structural concern being raised and dismissed. The words landed evenly, without accusation, without emotion, which made them heavier. Daniel's grip on the edge of the table tightened just slightly, enough to feel the tension in his own hand. We were not made aware of any confirmed issue, he said, and even as he spoke, the sentence felt incomplete, because awareness had been present, it had simply been ignored. The voice on the line paused for a brief moment, then answered. You were informed. A quiet certainty that left no room for interpretation. The call ended shortly after, not abruptly, not rudely, just conclusively, and the room remained still, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said, and far below, beyond the reach of glass walls and controlled environments. Marcus walked steadily down the sidewalk, the city moving around him unchanged, the weight of what had just unfolded resting nowhere on his expression, only in the quiet alignment of a decision that had already been made. Daniel did not sit down, he remained standing at the head of the table as if movement might confirm something he was not ready to accept. The silence around him no longer felt neutral, it felt pointed, shaped by everything that had just unfolded. The projection screen still displayed the same model, unchanged, but now it looked different, not because the data had shifted, but because the context had. The senior analyst slowly turned her laptop toward him, not dramatically, not confrontational, just enough for him to see what she had been tracing, the variance curve expanding under extended simulation, subtle at first, then widening with time, a flaw that did not shout, but waited. Patient and precise, Daniel leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the data with a focus that had not been there before. The room watched without speaking, because this was no longer a presentation, it was a realization unfolding in real time. Run the extended load again, he said quietly. The analyst nodded, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, the system recalculating, the numbers updating line by line, and there it was again, not a glitch, not an anomaly, but a pattern, consistent, repeatable, undeniable. Daniel straightened slowly, the controlled confidence that had carried him earlier now replaced by something heavier, something closer to understanding. His gaze drifted briefly toward the empty space near the end of the table, the place where Marcus had stood, the moment replaying with uncomfortable clarity, the interruption, the dismissal, the certainty that had overridden curiosity. He exhaled once, steady but deeper than before, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding. He tried to point this out, the analyst said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what had become obvious. Daniel did not respond immediately, because the answer did not need to be spoken, it was already present in the room, in the data, in the silence that had replaced momentum. One of the investors on the screen leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral. Who identified this issue first? He asked, the question simple, direct, unavoidable. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not out of resistance, but because the truth now carried weight he could not redirect. It was raised earlier, he said, choosing words carefully, but even careful words could not soften what they revealed. The investor nodded once, slow, measured. And it was dismissed, he added, not asking, not guessing, just confirming. The room remained still, because no one could offer an alternative version of what had happened. Daniel's eyes lowered briefly to the table, the polished surface reflecting a distorted version of his own posture. Controlled on the outside, unsettled. Beneath it, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not try to lead the room forward, he did not try to restore momentum, because momentum without foundation no longer meant progress, it meant risk, and that difference had just cost them everything. Across the room the analyst closed her laptop slowly, not as a conclusion, but as acknowledgement. The deal was gone, the assumption was broken. And the one voice that had tried to redirect it had been removed before it could be heard. Daniel turned toward the window again, the city still stretching wide beyond the glass, unchanged, indifferent, moving forward without pause, and in that reflection, layered faintly over the skyline, he saw the moment he had missed, not because it was hidden, but because he had chosen not to see it. The room did not try to recover, not immediately, not forcefully, because there was no clear direction left to move toward. The absence of the deal had created a space that no one rushed to fill. Daniel remained near the window for a moment longer before turning back, slower this time, as if each step required intention rather than habit. The reflection of the skyline faded from the glass as he faced the room again. And for the first time, his posture did not carry authority, it carried awareness. He reached for his phone, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then unlocked it, scrolling past emails, notifications, summaries that no longer held priority, until he found the internal directory, a list of names, titles, positions, and then one entry that stood out not because of status, but because of absence: Marcus Reed, temporary advisor. The label now felt inaccurate in a way that was difficult to ignore. Daniel tapped the contact, the screen shifted, a number appeared. Simple, unremarkable, and yet it carried more weight than anything else in the room at that moment. He did not call immediately. His thumb hovered just above the screen, not out of doubt, but because he understood that this call would not restore what had been lost, it would only acknowledge it. Across the table the senior analyst watched quietly, not intruding, not prompting, just observing the shift as it happened. The investors on the screen remained present but silent, their earlier confidence replaced with measured distance, waiting to see what came next. Daniel finally pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice, each tone stretching slightly longer than expected, until it connected. No greeting came from the other end, just the same quiet presence Marcus had carried earlier. Daniel spoke, his voice controlled but stripped of the ease it once held. "Marcus," he said, using the name this time, not the role, not the position. A brief pause followed, not cold, not resistant, just still. Daniel continued, choosing his words with care. "There was a critical issue in the model," he said, and even as he spoke, the phrasing felt insufficient, because it did not capture what had actually happened. He adjusted slightly, correcting himself. "You identified it." The admission landed plainly, without decoration. Marcus did not respond immediately, the silence on the line not empty, but measured, as if allowing the words to settle before deciding whether they mattered. Daniel drew a quiet breath. "We should have listened," he added, and this time there was no adjustment, no refinement, just the truth as it stood, simple and complete. The city noise filtered faintly through Marcus's side of the call, distant traffic, a passing siren far enough away to be background rather than interruption. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried the same steady tone it always had, unchanged by what had happened. "You had the information," he said, not accusatory, not sharp, just clear. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened slightly, not enough to show strain, just enough to feel it. "We want to correct this," he said, the instinct to move forward still present. Even now, Marcus's response came without hesitation. "It was not a correction problem," he said, and the distinction settled immediately, because correction implied something could still be adjusted, something could still be repaired. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of that difference becoming clearer with each passing second. The room behind him remained silent, listening without appearing to, because the conversation had shifted beyond business, beyond numbers, into something less tangible but far more defining. Daniel exhaled slowly. "What would it take to move forward again?" he asked, not as a demand, not as an assumption, but as a question he already suspected had no simple answer, and on the other end, Marcus paused just long enough for the silence to speak before he did. Marcus did not rush to answer. The city moved around him in steady motion, footsteps passing, traffic shifting, light reflecting off glass in sharp fragments that never stayed in one place for long. He stood near the edge of the sidewalk, phone held loosely against his ear, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead that was not tied to any single point. Daniel's question lingered between them, not urgent, not demanding, just present. Marcus finally spoke, his voice unchanged, calm, measured. "It is not about moving forward," he said, the words landing softly but carrying a weight that settled immediately. Daniel remained still, the room behind him silent, every person within it listening without appearing to. Marcus continued. "You had clarity when it mattered." A brief pause followed, not to create tension, but to allow the truth to stand on its own. "You chose momentum instead." Daniel closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be noticed by others, but long enough to register the accuracy of what had been said. The difference between error and decision no longer blurred, it was clear now, defined. Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting his stance as a breeze moved past him, carrying the distant sound of a passing train beneath the street. "The model can be corrected," he added, and for a moment, the sentence created space, the possibility of resolution, but it did not last. "But trust does not scale the same way," he finished, the distinction settling deeper than any technical flaw. Daniel's grip on the phone eased slightly, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had changed form, becoming something quieter, heavier, more permanent. He looked around the room, at the people who had followed his lead, at the screens that had reflected his certainty, at the data that now told a different story, and then back toward the window where the city continued without pause. "I understand," he said, and this time the words were not part of a strategy, not part of a negotiation, they were simply acknowledgement. Marcus did not respond immediately, not because there was more to say, but because nothing more was needed. The silence that followed was not empty, it was complete. Daniel lowered the phone slightly, as if the conversation had already reached its natural end. Marcus spoke one last time, not louder, not softer, just clear. "Respect is not a patch you apply after failure." The sentence remained steady, unshaken by emotion, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Daniel's eyes dropped briefly to the table, the polished surface reflecting a version of himself that no longer matched the confidence he had carried earlier. "I hear you," he said quietly, and this time, there was no attempt to reshape the outcome. Marcus ended the call with a single tap, the screen dimming instantly, the connection gone without ceremony. He slipped the phone back into his jacket and took a step forward, merging into the flow of the city as if he had always been part of it. No one around him noticed the decision that had just closed the $2.4 billion door. No one paused, no one turned. The world continued in its usual rhythm. Above, the conference room remained still, not frozen, not broken, just quieter than before, the kind of quiet that does not demand attention but changes everything. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, then set his phone down on the table, the faint sound of it meeting the surface barely audible, and in the reflection of the glass, layered over the endless movement of the city, there was no longer a sense of control, only the quiet outline of a lesson that had arrived without warning and stayed without permission.